Eleanor Patterson's weathered hands trembled as she set down her morning coffee, the ceramic mug hitting the wooden table with a sharp clink. Through her kitchen window, 4 pairs of piercing blue eyes stared back at her, not the gentle gaze of domestic animals, but the intense, knowing look of creatures that had grown from helpless cubs into magnificent predators. The government vehicle's engine rumbled closer up her mountain driveway. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's panicked voice crackled through the phone. "Eleanor, they're coming for them. Marcus Thompson has a federal warrant." The 4 wolves pressed closer to the cabin walls, their massive frames casting shadows across the sunlit meadow where they'd played as babies just 3 years ago. Eleanor remembered their first night. Tiny, whimpering bundles she'd bottle-fed every 2 hours, believing they were abandoned puppies. "Get inside now," she whispered urgently to her family, though her heart shattered knowing this might be their last morning together. Who would have believed that saving 4 dying cubs would lead to this moment? And how could she possibly choose between the law and the only children she'd ever known? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years earlier, Eleanor Patterson had awakened each morning to the same suffocating silence that had filled her mountain cabin since Robert's death. At 75, the former pediatric nurse found herself questioning whether her remaining years held any purpose beyond the daily routine of feeding birds and tending a garden that seemed pointless without someone to share its harvest. The cabin Robert had built with his own hands sat on 40 acres of pristine Montana wilderness, 8 miles from the nearest neighbor. What once felt like paradise now felt like a beautiful prison. Eleanor had spent 45 years caring for other people's children in the hospital, her gentle hands soothing countless fevered brows, and her soft voice calming frightened little ones. Yet life had cruelly denied her the one thing she'd wanted most: children of her own. 3 miscarriages had left scars deeper than any physical wound, and now, in the twilight of her life, that emptiness echoed through every room. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the local veterinarian, made monthly visits under the pretense of checking on Eleanor's health, though both women knew it was really about combating the isolation that consumed too many elderly residents in these remote mountains. Sarah, 45 and unmarried herself, understood the particular loneliness of women whose nurturing instincts had nowhere to flow. Their friendship had become Eleanor's sole connection to the outside world, aside from Tom Bradley's weekly supply runs when he delivered mail and groceries. The recent health scare, a mild heart episode that had landed Eleanor in the county hospital for 3 days, had forced her to confront her mortality with uncomfortable clarity. Robert's final words echoed in her memory. "Find something to love, Ellie. Don't let your heart go unused." At the time, she'd thought he meant remarrying, which seemed impossible. How could she explain to potential suitors that she talked to her husband's photograph every morning, or that she sometimes set 2 places at the dinner table out of habit? The mountain spring of her 75th year arrived with unusual warmth, melting the last of winter's snow earlier than expected. Eleanor had established a morning ritual of sitting on her back porch with coffee, watching the wildlife emerge from hibernation. Deer grazed in the meadow beyond her garden, and various birds returned to reclaim their nesting spots in the towering pines. These small signs of renewal offered modest comfort, though they couldn't fill the aching void where purpose should have lived. Eleanor's days stretched endlessly before her, punctuated only by household chores and the occasional phone call from distant relatives who felt obligated to check on the old widow. She'd begun to wonder if this was how her story would end, alone in a cabin filled with memories, her capacity for love slowly withering like flowers without water. The irony wasn't lost on her that a woman who'd spent decades nurturing life now felt her own slipping away, not from illness, but from the simple absence of anyone who truly needed her. The silence that greeted Eleanor on that crisp April morning felt different, heavier, somehow charged with anticipation. She'd grown accustomed to the symphony of awakening wildlife that typically accompanied her sunrise coffee ritual, but today the forest held its breath. Even the chattering squirrels that usually raided her bird feeders were nowhere to be seen. A sound broke through the unnatural quiet, a faint whimpering that tugged at Eleanor's maternal instincts like a physical pull. She set down her coffee mug and listened more carefully, her trained nurse's ear detecting distress in the weak, rhythmic cries. The sound seemed to emanate from the pine grove behind her cabin, where Robert had once planned to build a workshop but never found the time. Despite her arthritic knees protesting with each step, Eleanor made her way across the dew-soaked grass toward the source of the distress. The whimpering grew stronger as she approached a fallen log surrounded by thick undergrowth. What she discovered there would change everything. 4 tiny creatures huddled together in a shallow depression beneath the log, their eyes barely open, bodies no larger than Robert's old work boots. Eleanor's heart lurched as she recognized the signs of abandonment, dehydration, weakness, the desperate vulnerability of newborns left without their mother. In 45 years of nursing, she'd seen enough suffering to know these babies wouldn't survive another night without intervention. Her first thought was gratitude that someone had abandoned puppies near her home rather than letting them die in the wilderness. Mixed breeds were common in rural Montana, often the result of irresponsible pet owners who couldn't handle litters. The timing felt almost providential, as if the universe had finally answered her prayers for something to love and protect. Eleanor's nursing instincts overwhelmed any practical concerns about taking on such responsibility at her age. She gathered the cubs, for they were clearly very young, into her cardigan, their tiny bodies fitting easily against her chest. The smallest one barely responded to her touch, its breathing shallow and irregular. "Not on my watch," she whispered, the words echoing Robert's determination whenever he'd faced a seemingly impossible repair project. Inside the cabin, Eleanor transformed her spare bedroom into an improvised nursery. She lined a cardboard box with Robert's old flannel shirts, their familiar scent somehow appropriate for this new beginning. The heating pad she'd used for her arthritis now provided warmth for 4 helpless lives, while her determination provided the will to save them. Naming them felt important, a way of claiming them as family. The largest, clearly the most robust, she called Atlas, strong enough to carry the world. The one with the loudest cry became Luna for her nocturnal vocalizations. The darkest one, always seeming to fade into shadows, became Shadow. And the smallest, the one fighting hardest to survive, became Hope. Eleanor spent that first night in the rocking chair beside their makeshift bed, feeding them puppy formula from tiny bottles every 2 hours. Her body ached from the constant care, but her spirit soared with renewed purpose. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt truly needed. Each successful feeding, each sign of growing strength, filled the emptiness that had consumed her for 5 long years. Hope proved the most challenging, requiring extra attention and frequent encouragement to eat. Eleanor found herself talking constantly to the tiny creature, sharing stories about Robert, about her nursing career, about the dreams they'd had for children of their own. The one-sided conversations felt natural, therapeutic even, as if she was finally able to channel all her unused maternal energy. As the cubs grew stronger over the following days, Eleanor began to notice their rapid development. They seemed to grow faster than she'd expected, their ears standing up earlier than normal puppies, their facial features developing a lean, angular quality that struck her as unusual. Their energy levels increased dramatically, and they began exploring beyond their box with surprising coordination. Most remarkable were their eyes. As the blue began to appear, Eleanor was struck by their unusual intensity and clarity. She'd never seen such piercing blue eyes in dogs, and certainly not in entire litters. The color seemed almost luminescent, catching light in a way that made them appear almost otherworldly in their beauty. But Eleanor was too enchanted by the daily miracle of their survival and growth to question these differences seriously. Each morning brought new discoveries. First steps, first playful tumbles, first attempts at puppy barks that sounded oddly musical. They followed her everywhere, a devoted pack of four that filled her home with life and laughter for the first time in years. The cubs transformed not just Eleanor's daily routine, but her entire perspective on her remaining years. She found herself planning for their future, researching proper nutrition, and even considering modifications to her property to give them adequate space to run and play. Robert would have loved this, she thought, watching them wrestle with an old sock. Finally, she had the family they'd always dreamed of. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's monthly visit arrived 6 weeks after Eleanor had discovered the cubs, and nothing could have prepared either woman for the shock that awaited. Sarah had been making these wellness checks since Robert's death, partly from professional obligation, but mostly from genuine affection for the elderly widow who'd become like family to her. She expected to find Eleanor in her usual state of quiet resignation, perhaps a bit more animated than usual if she'd received a letter from distant relatives. Instead, Sarah found Eleanor radiant with purpose, her eyes bright with an energy that had been absent for years. The transformation was so dramatic that Sarah initially wondered if Eleanor had started new medication, or perhaps found romance with one of the widowers from town. That theory evaporated the moment Eleanor proudly led her to the spare bedroom to meet her new family. 4 magnificent creatures greeted Sarah's arrival with alert, intelligent gazes that immediately triggered her veterinary instincts. These were not the mixed-breed puppies Eleanor believed them to be. The facial structure, the ear set, the body proportions, the unusually rapid growth rate, every professional fiber in Sarah's being screamed the same conclusion. These were wolf cubs, and they were thriving under Eleanor's devoted care. "Eleanor," Sarah said carefully, struggling to maintain her composure while her mind raced through the legal implications, "where exactly did you find these puppies?" Eleanor's face glowed with maternal pride as she described that morning 6 weeks ago, how she'd rescued them from certain death, how they'd grown so quickly and bonded so completely with her. She pointed out their remarkable blue eyes, their intelligence, their devotion. "Aren't they beautiful, Sarah? I've never seen puppies quite like them." Sarah knelt beside the cubs, her trained eye cataloging the unmistakable features that Eleanor's loving but untrained gaze had missed. The elongated snouts, the high-set ears, the powerful hindquarters, the distinctive gait. These animals were pure wolf, and the blue eyes that Eleanor found so enchanting indicated an extremely rare genetic mutation that occurred in perhaps 1 in 10,000 wolves. The weight of the situation settled on Sarah's shoulders like a crushing burden. Federal law made keeping wolves illegal without special permits that took years to obtain and required facilities that Eleanor's modest cabin could never provide. The penalties included heavy fines and potential imprisonment, devastating consequences for a 75-year-old woman whose only crime had been saving abandoned babies. "Eleanor, we need to talk," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. "These aren't mixed breeds. They're wolves." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She stared at Sarah in disbelief, then looked at the 4 cubs who were playfully tumbling around her feet, completely at ease in her presence. "That's impossible. They're just unusual-looking dogs. Look how gentle they are with me." Sarah's heart broke as she watched Eleanor's world begin to crumble. "I wish I were wrong, but I'm certain. Everything about them, their growth rate, their facial structure, their behavior patterns, they're wolves, Eleanor. And keeping them is a federal crime." Eleanor sank into her rocking chair, her hands trembling as the full implications crashed over her. Atlas, sensing her distress, immediately moved to her side and placed his large head on her lap, gazing up at her with those remarkable blue eyes that held such obvious devotion. Luna pressed against her other leg, while Shadow and Hope positioned themselves protectively around the chair. "They'll take them away," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "They'll put them in cages or worse. Sarah, these babies would have died without me. I saved them. They're my children now." The irony was devastating. Eleanor had finally found her purpose, had discovered the maternal fulfillment that had eluded her entire life, and now the law threatened to tear it all away. Sarah watched the cubs' reaction to Eleanor's distress, noting how they seemed to understand her emotional state and respond with comforting behavior that contradicted everything she'd been taught about wild wolves. Sarah faced an impossible choice between her professional obligations and her personal loyalty to Eleanor. As a licensed veterinarian, she was legally required to report the discovery of illegally kept wildlife. But as Eleanor's friend, she couldn't bear to be the instrument of such devastating loss. "There has to be a solution," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength as she stroked Atlas's massive head. "I won't give them up, Sarah. I can't. They need me, and God knows I need them." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, each one seeming more hopeless than the last. Wildlife sanctuaries required surrender of the animals. Government facilities meant permanent separation. Private permits were virtually impossible to obtain, especially for someone with no professional wildlife experience. "If authorities discover them, I won't be able to protect you," Sarah said finally. "The penalties are severe, Eleanor. You could face years in prison." Eleanor looked down at the four wolves who had transformed her lonely existence into something filled with love and purpose. Hope, the smallest, had climbed into her lap and was gazing at her with complete trust. The thought of these magnificent creatures being torn from the only home they'd ever known, caged like criminals for the crime of being loved, filled her with a fierce determination she hadn't felt in decades. "Then they won't discover them," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the steel that had sustained her through 45 years of nursing crises. "I'll be more careful. I'll keep them hidden." Sarah stared at her friend, seeing not the frail widow she'd been visiting for 5 years, but a woman transformed by purpose into someone formidable. Eleanor had made her choice, and Sarah realized she'd made hers too. "I'll give you time to figure something out," Sarah said quietly. "But Eleanor, this can't go on forever. Someone will notice eventually." Eleanor nodded, understanding the risks but unwilling to abandon the family that had given her life meaning again. As Sarah prepared to leave, she looked back at the extraordinary scene, an elderly woman surrounded by 4 wolves who clearly adored her, a bond that defied everything she'd learned about wildlife behavior. "Be careful, my friend," Sarah whispered, knowing that Eleanor had chosen love over law, and that such choices always came with a price. The 2 years that followed, Dr. Sarah's revelation, transformed Eleanor's life into a delicate balance between profound joy and constant vigilance. What had once been a simple, lonely existence became a complex dance of secrecy, adaptation, and the deepest love she had ever known. Every day brought new challenges as 4 wolf cubs grew into magnificent adult wolves, their bond with Eleanor deepening even as the risks of discovery multiplied. Eleanor's daily routine evolved around her unusual family's needs. Dawn brought feeding time, requiring increasingly large quantities of raw meat that she ordered from distant suppliers to avoid arousing local suspicion. She learned to butcher deer that Tom Bradley occasionally brought her, claiming they were for her own consumption while secretly feeding her wolves the diet their wild nature demanded. The expense steadily drained her modest savings, but Eleanor considered every dollar well spent for the privilege of caring for her children. Atlas emerged as the undisputed alpha of their small pack, his protective instincts toward Eleanor growing stronger with each passing month. Now weighing nearly 100 pounds, he possessed the lean, powerful build of his wild ancestors, yet remained gentle as a lamb in Eleanor's presence. His intelligence astounded her daily. He seemed to understand not just her words but her emotions, responding to her moods with an intuitive sensitivity that surpassed any domestic animal she'd known. Luna became Eleanor's constant shadow, rarely straying more than a few feet from her side. The female wolf had developed an almost mystical ability to sense Eleanor's needs before Eleanor herself recognized them. When arthritis flared in Eleanor's knees, Luna would position herself as a living support. During Eleanor's occasional bouts of grief for Robert, Luna would rest her massive head in Eleanor's lap, offering wordless comfort that no human consolation could match. Shadow lived up to his name, serving as the pack's scout and sentinel. His acute senses detected approaching vehicles long before human ears could hear them, giving Eleanor precious minutes to hide her wolves in the specially constructed shelter Robert's old workshop had become. Eleanor had reinforced the building's walls and installed soundproofing, creating a secure retreat where her wolves could wait safely during unexpected visits. Hope, though still the smallest of the four, had grown into a beautiful wolf with an almost ethereal quality. Her pale gray coat and striking blue eyes gave her an otherworldly appearance that never failed to take Eleanor's breath away. Hope remained the most playful, often initiating games that would have terrified strangers, but filled Eleanor with delight. The wolf's gentle nature and obvious intelligence made her Eleanor's special favorite, though Eleanor was careful never to show favoritism that might disrupt pack dynamics. Training her wolves required Eleanor to learn their language and psychology in ways no textbook could teach. She discovered that wolves communicated through subtle body language, ear positions, tail movements, and eye contact that carried complex meanings. Eleanor found herself becoming fluent in this silent vocabulary, able to convey approval, concern, or commands with nothing more than a glance or gesture. The wolves' response to training exceeded all expectations. They learned to come when called, to retreat to their shelter on command, and most importantly, to remain absolutely silent when strangers approached. Eleanor marveled at their intelligence and adaptability, wondering how anyone could consider these magnificent creatures mere predators worthy only of fear and elimination. Close calls became increasingly frequent as the wolves matured and their presence became harder to conceal. Tom Bradley's weekly supply runs grew tense as Eleanor deflected his curious questions about the large dog tracks he occasionally noticed around her property. She explained them away as strays that wandered through, but noticed his suspicious glances when unusual sounds echoed from the workshop during his visits. One particularly harrowing morning, Eleanor's neighbor from 8 miles away arrived unexpectedly to borrow tools. Eleanor managed to signal her wolves to retreat just moments before he knocked, but Atlas's protective instincts nearly betrayed them all. The wolf's low growl from the workshop could have been mistaken for machinery, but Eleanor's heart hammered as she made small talk while praying Atlas would remain quiet. Doctor. Sarah's monthly visits became exercises in carefully orchestrated theater. Sarah would examine Eleanor while the wolves remained hidden, both women maintaining the pretense of normal wellness checks while Sarah discreetly assessed signs of the wolves' health and well-being. Sarah's medical bag began carrying wolf-specific medications and supplements, hidden beneath supplies for her human patient. The emotional toll of constant secrecy began affecting Eleanor's health in ways that concerned Sarah. The stress of hiding her wolves, combined with the physical demands of caring for 4 large predators, left Eleanor thinner and more fragile-looking than before. Yet paradoxically, her spirit blazed brighter than it had in years. The purpose and love her wolves provided sustained her through difficulties that might have overwhelmed a younger person. Eleanor's isolation from the outside world deepened as she declined social invitations and avoided situations that might lead to discovery. Church attendance ceased. Shopping trips became rare events planned around her wolves' schedules, and phone conversations grew brief and guarded. She told concerned relatives that her health required more rest and solitude, using her age as an excuse for behavior that actually stemmed from fierce protectiveness of her secret family. The wolves' diet became an increasingly expensive challenge as they reached full size. Eleanor contacted meat suppliers hundreds of miles away, claiming to run a small private zoo to explain her need for large quantities of raw meat. The monthly cost consumed most of her Social Security income and began eating into her modest savings, but Eleanor never hesitated to provide whatever her wolves needed. Winter brought new difficulties as the wolves' exercise needs conflicted with the necessity of keeping them hidden. Eleanor constructed an elaborate system of covered runs connecting the workshop to various outbuildings, allowing her wolves freedom of movement without exposure to potential observers. She spent hours each day walking with them through the forest behind her property, always vigilant for signs of other humans while reveling in her wolves' joy at being in their natural element. The bond between Eleanor and her wolves deepened in ways that defied scientific explanation. They seemed to anticipate her needs, offering comfort during her difficult days and sharing her joy during moments of contentment. When Eleanor fell ill with a severe cold that winter, all 4 wolves took turns lying beside her bed, their body heat and presence speeding her recovery in ways no medicine could have achieved. Eleanor began keeping detailed journals documenting her wolves' behavior, intelligence, and the remarkable depth of their emotional connections. She recorded conversations with them, noting how they responded to different tones of voice and seemed to understand far more human language than should have been possible. These notebooks became her treasure, proof of the extraordinary relationship she'd built with creatures most people considered irredeemably wild and dangerous. As spring returned for the second time since their arrival, Eleanor faced the reality that her secret could not remain hidden indefinitely. The wolves were now fully mature, their howls occasionally echoing across the mountain valleys despite her efforts to discourage such behavior. She researched wolf sanctuaries and preserves, hoping to find a solution that would allow her to remain involved in their lives, but every option required complete surrender of her wolves to professional handlers. The thought of separation from her wolves filled Eleanor with a dread deeper than her fear of death. These magnificent creatures had given her a reason to live, a purpose that made every sunrise meaningful. They had become not just her companions, but her children in every way that mattered, and the prospect of losing them seemed crueler than any fate she could imagine. Eleanor's devotion to her wolves transformed her from a retiring widow into a fierce protector who would risk everything for their well-being. She had crossed legal and social boundaries that could never be uncrossed, committed to a path that offered no safe retreat. Yet as she watched her wolves play in the meadow behind her cabin, their blue eyes sparkling with intelligence and affection, Eleanor knew she would make the same choice again without hesitation. The secret that had begun as a simple act of compassion had evolved into something that challenged everything society believed about the relationship between humans and wild animals. Eleanor and her wolves had proven that love could bridge any divide, that family could transcend species, and that sometimes the most profound connections formed in defiance of every law and convention. But secrets, especially ones involving 4 full-grown wolves with piercing blue eyes, have a way of demanding revelation, and Eleanor's carefully constructed world was about to face its ultimate test. The black government SUV kicked up a cloud of dust as it wound its way up Eleanor's mountain driveway on a crisp October morning, carrying with it the end of her carefully guarded world. Marcus Thompson sat rigid in the passenger seat, his jaw set with the grim determination of a man who had built his entire career on enforcing wildlife protection laws. At 35, he commanded respect throughout the Federal Wildlife Service for his unwavering commitment to regulations that others sometimes bent for emotional reasons. Today's mission should have been routine: investigate reports of illegally kept wolves and confiscate the animals for proper relocation. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was the way his carefully constructed professional armor would crack the moment he laid eyes on Eleanor Patterson. As she emerged from her cabin to meet the enforcement team, something about her bearing, the quiet dignity mixed with fierce protectiveness, reminded him painfully of his own mother, Sarah Thompson, who had died 27 years ago defending him from a wolf attack during a camping trip in Yellowstone. Eleanor stood on her porch, her silver hair catching the morning sunlight, her 75-year-old frame somehow radiating a strength that made Marcus pause. Behind her, through the cabin's windows, he could see movement, large shapes shifting in the shadows, waiting. The anonymous tip that had brought him here claimed she was harboring 4 full-grown wolves, a violation that typically resulted in immediate confiscation and substantial federal charges. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus announced, stepping out of the vehicle with his badge displayed. "I'm Marcus Thompson with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We've received reports that you're keeping wolves without proper federal permits." "I need to inspect your property." Eleanor's chin lifted with a defiance that surprised him. "Those reports are mistaken, Mr. Thompson. I have 4 dogs, large mixed breeds, but dogs nonetheless." Marcus had heard such denials countless times before, but something in Eleanor's voice gave him pause. This wasn't the stammering fear of someone caught red-handed, but the steady conviction of someone protecting what she loved most. Behind Eleanor, a low rumble echoed from within the cabin. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine, but a sound that made the hair on Marcus's neck stand up. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside while we conduct our investigation," Marcus said, his training taking over even as something deeper in his psyche recoiled from the necessity of this action. "If you're harboring wolves, you're in violation of federal law, and those animals will need to be relocated to appropriate facilities." Eleanor's eyes flashed with a fire that reminded Marcus so strongly of his mother that he had to look away. "Mr. Thompson, whatever you think you're going to find here, I want you to know that I saved 4 dying babies 3 years ago. I've given them nothing but love and care, and they've never hurt a soul." The cabin door opened slightly, and Marcus caught his first glimpse of Eleanor's dogs. Atlas emerged first, his massive frame and unmistakably lupine features immediately confirming the reports. But what stopped Marcus cold wasn't the wolf's size or obvious wildness, it was the animal's behavior. Instead of displaying aggression or fear at the sight of strangers, Atlas positioned himself protectively beside Eleanor, his intelligent blue eyes assessing the threat level while remaining calm and controlled. Luna appeared next, followed by Shadow and Hope, until all 4 wolves stood flanking Eleanor like a devoted honor guard. Marcus had encountered hundreds of wolves in his career, both in captivity and in the wild, but he had never seen anything like this. These animals showed no signs of the stress, aggression, or fear that typically characterized wolves confronted by humans. Instead, they seemed to take their cues entirely from Eleanor, remaining alert but non-threatening as long as she appeared calm. "Dear God," whispered Officer Janet Mills, Marcus's colleague, her hand instinctively moving toward her tranquilizer gun. "Those are definitely wolves, and they're enormous." Marcus found himself frozen between his duty and a growing recognition that nothing about this situation fit the standard patterns. These wolves weren't displaying typical pack behavior around humans. They weren't cowering or attacking. They were protecting Eleanor with a devotion that seemed almost impossible given their species. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said, his voice softer than he'd intended, "those are wolves, magnificent ones, but wolves nonetheless. Keeping them is a federal crime, punishable by heavy fines and imprisonment. They need to be relocated to a proper wildlife facility immediately." Eleanor's face crumpled with pain, but her voice remained steady. "They are my children, Mr. Thompson. I found them as babies, barely 3 weeks old, dying under a fallen log. Their mother was nowhere to be found. Would you have preferred I let them die?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, transporting him instantly to that terrible day in Yellowstone when he was 8 years old. His mother, Sarah, had made a similar choice when faced with what appeared to be an injured wolf cub near their campsite. She had approached the animal against park regulations, wanting to help what she perceived as a suffering creature. The adult wolves that attacked her had been protecting their young, but understanding their motivation hadn't made losing his mother any less devastating. Marcus watched Eleanor's wolves respond to her emotional distress, moving closer to provide comfort, rather than displaying the agitation that stress typically caused in wild animals. Atlas actually pressed his massive head against Eleanor's hand, offering silent support in a gesture so gentle and intentional that it challenged everything Marcus thought he knew about wolf behavior. "The law doesn't make exceptions for good intentions," Marcus said, though his conviction wavered as he spoke. "These animals pose a significant safety risk, regardless of how they've behaved so far. Wild animals are unpredictable, and wolves are apex predators." Eleanor looked directly into Marcus's eyes, and he saw something there that shook him to his core. Not defiance or fear, but a deep, abiding love that transformed her lined face into something almost luminous. "Mr. Thompson, in 3 years, these wolves have never shown me anything but love and loyalty. They've never harmed another living creature while in my care. They comfort me when I'm sad, protect me when I'm afraid, and give my life meaning when I thought I had none left." Hope, the smallest of the 4 wolves, seemed to sense the emotional intensity of the moment and moved to Eleanor's other side, her pale coat and remarkable blue eyes making her appear almost ethereal in the morning light. The sight of this powerful predator behaving with such obvious affection toward an elderly human woman created a cognitive dissonance that Marcus struggled to reconcile with his professional training. "Ma'am, personal attachment doesn't change federal wildlife law," Marcus said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "These animals belong in the wild or in properly licensed facilities with trained handlers." Eleanor's laugh held no humor, only bitter irony. "The wild. Mr. Thompson, these wolves have never known the wild. They were 3 weeks old when I found them, their eyes barely open. I am the only mother they've ever known, and this cabin is the only home they've ever had. Putting them in the wild would be a death sentence, and caging them would be a living death." Marcus felt the weight of his duty pressing against something deeper and more complex, a growing understanding that this situation defied the simple categories his training had prepared him for. Eleanor Patterson wasn't a wildlife trafficker or an irresponsible pet owner. She was a woman who had saved 4 dying animals and, in the process, had apparently achieved something that wildlife experts considered nearly impossible: a genuine, mutually beneficial relationship between humans and wolves. The moment stretched taut between them, filled with the weight of impossible choices and irreconcilable truths. Marcus Thompson's training overrode the growing conflict in his heart as he straightened his shoulders and reached for the tranquilizer equipment. Despite everything he had witnessed, the remarkable bond between Eleanor and her wolves, their gentle behavior, the obvious love that radiated between them, federal law remained unambiguous: Keeping wolves without proper permits was illegal, regardless of circumstances or intentions. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson, but I have no choice," Marcus said, his voice heavy with reluctant authority. "These animals must be confiscated for relocation to an appropriate federal facility. Please step away from them now." Eleanor's face went ashen, but she moved protectively in front of her wolves instead of stepping aside. "You'll have to go through me first, Mr. Thompson. These are my children, and I won't abandon them." Officer Mills emerged from the SUV with animal control equipment while Marcus radioed for backup units. The sight of the tranquilizer guns caused an immediate change in the wolf's demeanor. Atlas's ears flattened against his head and a low growl rumbled from his chest, not directed at Eleanor but clearly a warning to the approaching officers. Shadow melted back toward the cabin's shadows, his body language shifting into full alert mode while Luna pressed closer to Eleanor's side. "Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be," Marcus pleaded, genuinely pained by what he was about to do. "We're not here to hurt anyone, but those animals need to be secured for everyone's safety." The tranquilizer dart hit Atlas first, the large wolf stumbling as the sedative took effect. His blue eyes remained fixed on Eleanor even as his legs buckled, a soft whine escaping his throat that sounded heartbreakingly like an apology for failing to protect her. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, cradling his massive head as tears streamed down her face. "It's okay, my brave boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's not your fault." Luna was next, the female wolf's devotion to Eleanor evident even as the drugs coursed through her system. She fought the sedation longer than expected, struggling to stay conscious and close to the woman who had raised her from a cub. When she finally collapsed, it was with her head stretched toward Eleanor's outstretched hand. Shadow attempted to flee but was cornered near the workshop, his wild instincts finally overriding years of domestication under stress. The sight of this magnificent animal reduced to a cowering, trapped creature struck Marcus with unexpected grief. Hope, the smallest and most trusting, simply stood beside Eleanor and allowed herself to be darted without resistance, as if understanding that fighting would only cause her beloved caretaker more pain. Eleanor's breakdown was complete as she watched her 4 children loaded unconsciously into transport cages. She clutched at Marcus's arm with surprising strength, her eyes wild with desperation. "Please, Mr. Thompson, they'll die in captivity. They don't know how to be wild animals. They only know how to be my family." The physical and emotional trauma of watching her wolves taken away triggered something catastrophic in Eleanor's elderly system. Her face went gray, her breathing became labored, and she collapsed onto her porch steps. One hand pressed against her chest as cardiac distress overwhelmed her fragile constitution. "Call an ambulance!" Marcus shouted, his professional demeanor cracking as he knelt beside the woman whose world he had just destroyed. Eleanor's pulse was erratic, her skin clammy, and her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that indicated serious cardiovascular compromise. As paramedics worked to stabilize Eleanor, Marcus rode with her to the county hospital, haunted by her whispered words during the journey. They were all I had left. They were my reason for living. The elderly woman's vital signs remained dangerously unstable, her heart struggling to cope with the sudden, devastating loss of everything that had given her life meaning. At the Federal Wildlife Facility, the 4 wolves' condition deteriorated rapidly. Separated into individual enclosures according to protocol, they displayed classic signs of severe depression and anxiety. Atlas paced restlessly in his cage, his powerful frame growing gaunt as he refused food and water. Luna lay motionless in her enclosure, her head turned toward the wall, unresponsive to Handler's attempts at interaction. Shadow's wild instincts, suppressed for 3 years of domestic life, re-emerged in destructive ways as he repeatedly threw himself against the chain-link fencing until his nose bled. Hope, the gentlest of the four, simply lay still and silent, her remarkable blue eyes dull and lifeless without Eleanor's presence to animate them. Ducked. Patricia Wells, the facility's head veterinarian, had seen wildlife adapt to captivity countless times, but these wolves' behavior was unprecedented. "They're not responding like typical wolves," she reported to Marcus during one of his daily check-ins. "Their depression is severe, almost human-like in its intensity. They appear to be grieving." Meanwhile, Eleanor remained hospitalized, her condition critical but stable. She refused to eat, barely spoke to medical staff, and stared at the ceiling with the hollow-eyed despair of someone who had lost everything worth living for. Dr. Sarah Mitchell visited daily, helpless to comfort her friend whose spirit had been broken along with her heart. "She's given up," Sarah confided to the cardiac specialist. Those wolves weren't just pets to her. They were her children, her purpose, her entire reason for existing. "I don't think she wants to recover." The media discovered the story within days, transforming Eleanor's private tragedy into a public controversy that divided opinion across the country. Animal rights activists rallied to her defense, arguing that the bond between Eleanor and her wolves represented something remarkable and beautiful that should be preserved, not destroyed. Wildlife protection advocates countered that laws existed for good reasons, and that emotional attachment couldn't override public safety concerns. Marcus found himself at the center of the storm, criticized by both sides for either being too harsh or too lenient in handling the situation. Sleep eluded him as he struggled with growing doubts about his actions. He visited the wildlife facility obsessively, watching Eleanor's wolves waste away in their individual cells, their behavior so unlike any captive wolves he had previously encountered. "They're dying, Doctor," Wells told him bluntly after 2 weeks of watching the animal's steady decline. "Not from disease or injury, but from what appears to be emotional trauma. I've never seen anything like it in 20 years of wildlife veterinary medicine." Hope's condition became critical first, the smallest wolf's refusal to eat or drink pushing her to the brink of death. Her weight dropped alarmingly, and her beautiful blue eyes began to lose their focus. The sight of this gentle creature dying slowly in captivity because she missed the woman who had raised her struck Marcus with a guilt so profound it made him physically ill. At the hospital, Eleanor's own condition remained precarious. Her heart, weakened by age and broken by loss, struggled to maintain its rhythm. She spoke only in whispers when she spoke at all, asking repeatedly about her wolves' welfare and growing more distressed with each evasive answer from hospital staff who had no information to share. The parallel decline of woman and wolves created a narrative that captured national attention and forced Marcus to confront the possibility that his strict adherence to protocol had created a tragedy rather than prevented one. For the first time in his career, he began to question whether the law he had sworn to uphold served justice in this particular case. As Hope slipped closer to death and Eleanor showed no signs of recovery, Marcus realized that his decision to separate them might have condemned both woman and wolves to a slow, agonizing end. The weight of that possibility pressed down on him like a physical burden, forcing him to consider whether strict enforcement of regulations could sometimes cause more harm than the violations they were meant to prevent. The tragedy that had begun with the best of intentions, Eleanor's rescue of abandoned cubs and Marcus's faithful execution of his duties, had spiraled into something that satisfied no one and devastated everyone involved. In trying to protect both public safety and animal welfare, Marcus had achieved neither, leaving 4 wolves dying in captivity and an elderly woman broken by loss. 6 weeks after the confiscation, Dr. Patricia Wells called Marcus Thompson with news that shattered what remained of his professional confidence. Hope, the smallest of Eleanor's wolves, was dying. Despite every medical intervention available, the young wolf had stopped eating entirely and lay motionless in her enclosure, her striking blue eyes staring at nothing. The veterinary team had exhausted all options, and Hope's vital signs indicated she would likely not survive another 24 hours. "I've been a wildlife veterinarian for 20 years, Dr. Wells told Marcus over the phone, her voice heavy with frustration and sorrow. "I've seen animals adapt to captivity. I've seen them struggle, but I've never seen anything like this. These wolves are dying of what can only be described as heartbreak." Hope keeps looking toward the door as if she's waiting for someone who will never come. Marcus stared out his office window at the mountains in the distance, the same peaks that surrounded Eleanor's cabin where 4 wolf cubs had once played freely under the watchful eye of a woman who loved them unconditionally. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe. He had followed protocol perfectly, executed his duties exactly as trained, and the result was a slow-motion tragedy that haunted his every waking moment. Against all regulations and his better judgment, Marcus made a decision that would either save Hope's life or end his career. He called Dr. Sarah Mitchell at the county hospital where Eleanor remained in critical condition, her own will to live as diminished as her wolf's appetite for survival. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Marcus Thompson with Fish and Wildlife. I need to ask you something that's completely outside protocol. Would it be possible for Mrs. Patterson to visit one of her wolves? The smallest one is dying, and our veterinarian thinks—" Marcus paused, struggling to voice what sounded impossible even to him. "She thinks the wolf might recover if it could see Mrs. Patterson again." Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "Mr. Thompson, Eleanor hasn't spoken more than a few words since you took her wolves. She's barely eating, refuses physical therapy, and her cardiologist is concerned about her will to live. But if there's even a chance—" "It would have to be unofficial," Marcus continued, his career flashing before his eyes. "I can't authorize it through proper channels, but if you could somehow get Mrs. Patterson to the facility, I might be able to arrange a brief visit." 2 hours later, Sarah wheeled Eleanor into the federal wildlife facility in a borrowed wheelchair, the elderly woman's transformation shocking even to Marcus, who had been steeling himself for this moment. Eleanor had lost at least 20 pounds, her clothes hanging loosely on her diminished frame. Her silver hair had gone completely white, and her once bright eyes held the hollow look of someone who had simply stopped caring about her own survival. "Where is she?" Eleanor whispered, her first words to Marcus since their confrontation at her cabin. "Where is Hope?" Marcus led them through the facility's sterile corridors, past cages holding various wildlife awaiting relocation or rehabilitation. The institutional atmosphere, concrete floors, fluorescent lighting, the constant background noise of captive animals, created a stark contrast to the warm, homey environment where the wolves had spent their first 3 years of life. Hope's enclosure sat at the end of the corridor, separated from her siblings by protocol that Marcus now questioned with every fiber of his being. The small wolf lay on her side, her breathing shallow and labored, her once lustrous coat dull and matted. She had lost nearly 30 pounds and looked more like a dying dog than the magnificent predator she had been just weeks earlier. The moment Eleanor's wheelchair came into view, Hope's head lifted for the first time in days. Her blue eyes, clouded with illness and despair, suddenly focused with an intensity that made Dr. Wells gasp in amazement. The wolf struggled to her feet, her legs shaking with weakness, but managed to approach the fence that separated her from the woman who had raised her from a helpless cub. "Oh, my sweet girl," Eleanor whispered, reaching through the chain link to touch Hope's nose. "Mama's here. Mama's here." Hope pressed against the fence with what little strength she possessed, a soft whine escaping her throat, the first sound she had made since arriving at the facility. Her tail, motionless for weeks, gave a weak but unmistakable wag as she struggled to get closer to Eleanor through the barrier that separated them. Marcus watched this reunion with growing anguish, recognizing that he was witnessing something that challenged every assumption his training had given him about the relationship between humans and wild animals. This wasn't a case of misguided anthropomorphism or dangerous attachment to an unpredictable predator. This was genuine love between species, a bond so profound that its severing was killing both participants. "Can I go inside with her?" Eleanor asked, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Please, Mr. Thompson. She's dying because she thinks I abandoned her." Every regulation, every safety protocol, every aspect of Marcus's professional training screamed against allowing an elderly civilian into an enclosure with a wolf, even one as weakened as Hope. But as he looked at Eleanor's desperate face and Hope's obvious recognition and joy at seeing her again, Marcus realized that following protocol in this case would make him complicit in the death of both woman and wolf. "5 minutes," he said quietly, his hands shaking as he unlocked the enclosure. "And if anything goes wrong—" Eleanor transferred from her wheelchair to the enclosure floor with painful difficulty, but the moment she was inside, Hope summoned strength from somewhere deep within her depleted reserves and crawled into Eleanor's lap. The wolf, who had weighed nearly 70 pounds at her capture, now felt fragile and bird-like in Eleanor's arms, but her blue eyes blazed with a light that had been absent for weeks. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face as she stroked Hope's matted fur. "I never wanted to leave you. I fought for you, but they wouldn't let me keep you." Hope responded by pressing her face against Eleanor's neck, her breathing becoming less labored as she absorbed the comfort of physical contact with the only mother she had ever known. For the first time since her capture, the wolf relaxed completely, her body going limp with relief and exhaustion in Eleanor's embrace. "Doctor." Wells monitored Hope's vital signs throughout the visit, her medical instruments revealing what everyone in the room could see. The wolf's heart rate stabilized, her breathing improved, and her body temperature normalized for the first time in weeks. The proximity to Eleanor was having a measurable positive effect on Hope's physical condition, validating Dr. Wells's theory about the psychological component of the wolf's decline. As the 5 minutes stretched into 10, then 15, Marcus found himself unable to end the reunion. Eleanor's own transformation was as dramatic as Hope's. Color had returned to her cheeks, her breathing was stronger, and she looked more alive than she had since the confiscation. The healing power of their reunion was undeniable, forcing Marcus to confront the devastating consequences of his rigid adherence to regulations that failed to account for extraordinary circumstances. "She's going to start eating again," Eleanor said with quiet confidence, gently scratching behind Hope's ears in a gesture that had been part of their daily routine for 3 years. "She just needed to know that I didn't abandon her willingly." Marcus experienced a moment of clarity that would change the entire trajectory of his life and career. Standing in that sterile enclosure, watching an elderly woman and a dying wolf heal each other through simple presence and unconditional love, he understood that sometimes the law served justice best when it was tempered with mercy and human wisdom. For the first time since that terrible day at Eleanor's cabin, Marcus allowed himself to remember his mother not as a victim of wolf aggression, but as a woman whose final act had been one of love and protection. Sarah Thompson had died saving her son, demonstrating the same fierce maternal devotion that Eleanor had shown her wolves. The realization that he had been honoring his mother's memory by perpetuating fear rather than celebrating love struck him with transformative force. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion and newfound resolve, "we need to talk about finding a different solution for your family. 6 months after that transformative moment in Hope's enclosure, Eleanor Patterson stood on her cabin porch watching four magnificent wolves emerge from the forest behind her property, their blue eyes catching the golden light of a Montana sunset. The sight still took her breath away, not just because of their wild beauty, but because of everything they had overcome together to reach this moment of impossible harmony. The Glacier Wolf Education Center, as the hand-carved wooden sign at her driveway now proclaimed, had become reality through a combination of Marcus Thompson's newfound advocacy, Dr. Sarah Mitchell's unwavering support, and a groundswell of public opinion that had forced federal agencies to seek creative solutions rather than rigid enforcement. Eleanor's property had been officially designated as a wildlife education facility, with her wolves classified as educational ambassadors whose unique human socialized behavior made them invaluable for research and public education programs. Marcus, who had voluntarily transferred from enforcement to education services, arrived for his weekly visit just as the wolves completed their evening patrol of the property boundaries. His transformation from rigid enforcer to passionate advocate had surprised everyone except Eleanor, who had recognized a kindred spirit beneath his official facade from their first confrontation. The man who had once threatened to destroy her family had become their greatest protector and Eleanor's closest friend. "How are they adjusting to the new students coming next week?" Marcus asked as he joined Eleanor on the porch, accepting the cup of coffee she offered with hands that no longer shook with guilt when he looked at her wolves. "Atlas is ready to show off. Luna's nervous about strangers but excited about the attention. Shadow's prepared to demonstrate his tracking skills. And Hope." Eleanor smiled as the smallest wolf bounded toward them with puppy-like enthusiasm despite her 4 years of age. Hope just wants everyone to love her as much as she loves them. The education programs that justified the wolves' presence had exceeded all expectations. School groups, university researchers, and wildlife enthusiasts traveled from across the country to observe Eleanor's unique family and learn about wolf behavior, conservation, and the complex relationship between humans and predators. The wolves, secure in their bond with Eleanor, displayed natural behaviors while remaining calm around visitors in ways that captive-bred wolves rarely achieved. Dr. Patricia Wells, who had become a regular consultant for the facility, documented behaviors that challenged accepted theories about wolf domestication and human-animal bonds. Eleanor's wolves demonstrated problem-solving abilities, emotional intelligence, and social adaptability that suggested their early bonding with humans had created cognitive development pathways previously thought impossible in their species. "The research coming out of here is revolutionary," Dr. Wells explained to visiting scientists. "These wolves show us what's possible when human-animal relationships develop organically, based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than dominance or fear." Eleanor had initially resisted the scientific attention, fearing it would turn her wolves into laboratory subjects. But she quickly discovered that researchers who witnessed the genuine bond between her and her wolves became advocates rather than exploiters. Their published papers helped validate what Eleanor had always known, that love and trust could transcend species barriers when given the opportunity to develop naturally. The legal framework supporting Eleanor's guardianship had required months of negotiation between federal agencies, wildlife advocacy groups, and Eleanor's volunteer legal team. The solution satisfied multiple constituencies. Conservationists gained a unique research facility, educators received an unprecedented teaching tool, and Eleanor kept her family together while contributing to greater understanding of human-wildlife coexistence. Marcus's role as facility liaison had given him purpose he'd never found in pure enforcement. His mother's death, which had driven him to view wolves as enemies for most of his adult life, now motivated him to ensure that Eleanor and her wolves never faced the arbitrary separation that had nearly destroyed them all. He had found peace with his past by helping create a future where love could triumph over fear. "I have something to tell you," Eleanor said, as they watched the wolves settle for their evening rest. "Dr. Morrison says my heart is stronger than it's been in years. The cardiologist thinks I might have another decade or more with them." Marcus smiled, remembering the frail, broken woman he had helped load into an ambulance 6 months earlier. Eleanor's physical recovery had paralleled her wolves' emotional healing, creating a positive feedback loop that impressed her medical team. Her sense of purpose, the daily activity required to care for her wolves, and the profound satisfaction of meaningful work had restored her health in ways that no medication could have achieved. The wolves themselves had flourished beyond all expectations once reunited with Eleanor. Atlas had regained his confident leadership, organizing pack activities and maintaining protective watch over the property. Luna had returned to her role as Eleanor's shadow, rarely straying far from her side but now confident enough to interact positively with visitors. Shadow had discovered his calling as a demonstration wolf, showing visitors his natural tracking and hunting behaviors in controlled exercises that thrilled audiences while educating them about predator ecology. Hope had become the star of the education programs, her gentle nature and obvious affection for Eleanor creating powerful emotional connections that transformed visitors' perceptions of wolves. Children especially loved her, and Hope seemed to understand her role as ambassador, displaying patience and curiosity that made her an ideal representative for her species. Eleanor's cabin had been carefully modified to accommodate its new status while preserving the homey atmosphere that kept her wolves comfortable. A visitor center occupied Robert's former workshop. Displays explained wolf biology and conservation, and carefully designed viewing areas allowed educational groups to observe the wolves without disturbing their natural behaviors. The financial sustainability that had worried Eleanor initially proved unnecessary, as the facility's unique status attracted funding from conservation organizations, research grants, and modest visitor fees. Eleanor's personal expenses were covered, her wolves received optimal care, and the surplus supported other wildlife conservation projects throughout the region. Tom Bradley, who had suspected Eleanor's secret for years, became the facility's part-time caretaker and Eleanor's right-hand man in managing daily operations. His familiarity with the property and genuine affection for Eleanor made him ideal for handling logistics while she focused on her wolves and educational responsibilities. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been vindicated in her decision to support Eleanor despite professional risks. Her medical expertise proved invaluable in maintaining the wolves' health, and her research contributions earned recognition in veterinary circles. The friendship between the two women had deepened into something approaching family, with Sarah serving as Eleanor's unofficial second-in-command and closest confidant. As evening settled over the Montana mountains, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this place. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, saving 4 dying cubs, had evolved into something that challenged assumptions about wildlife management, human-animal relationships, and the power of love to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd followed standard protocol that day?" Eleanor asked Marcus, as they watched Hope demonstrate her evening play routine for Atlas's tolerant amusement. Marcus considered the question seriously, as he always did when confronting his near-catastrophic mistake. "I think 4 remarkable wolves would have died in captivity, 1 extraordinary woman would have died of heartbreak, and I would have spent the rest of my career wondering why following the rules felt so wrong." Eleanor nodded, understanding that Marcus carried his own scars from their initial confrontation. "I used to fear that loving them was selfish, that I was denying them their wild nature for my own emotional needs. But watching them now, seeing how they've touched so many lives and changed so many minds about wolves—" "You gave them something worth more than freedom," Marcus replied. "You gave them purpose, security, and unconditional love. And they've used those gifts to become teachers, ambassadors, and bridges between worlds that have been at war for too long. As if summoned by their conversation, all four wolves approached the porch where Eleanor and Marcus sat. Atlas settled beside Eleanor's chair with the dignity of a patriarch. Luna curled up at her feet. Shadow positioned himself as sentinel at the porch steps, and Hope simply climbed into Eleanor's lap despite her 70-pound weight. Looking into those four pairs of remarkable blue eyes, Eleanor saw not just the cubs she had saved, but the teachers they had become, the love they had shared, and the legacy they would leave for future generations trying to find balance between human needs and wildlife conservation. "Thank you," she whispered to them, as she did every evening, "for choosing me to be your mother." The wolves' eyes seemed to shimmer with understanding and contentment, reflecting a truth that would resonate far beyond this mountain sanctuary. That love, patience, and mutual respect could overcome any barrier, heal any wound, and create possibilities that existed nowhere except in the space between an open heart and a willing soul. At 75, Eleanor Patterson thought her story was ending, a lonely widow in an empty cabin, wondering if her capacity to love would die unused. Then 4 dying wolf cubs changed everything. What started as a simple act of compassion became a journey that proved it's never too late to find your purpose, build an extraordinary family, and touch countless lives. Eleanor's bond with Atlas, Luna, Shadow, and Hope challenged everything experts believed about human-animal relationships and showed the world that love truly knows no boundaries. Despite facing federal charges and nearly losing everything she cherished, Eleanor's unwavering devotion transformed not just her own life, but created a legacy that continues educating and inspiring people today. Her story reminds us that our most meaningful chapters often begin when we think the book is closing. Sometimes the family we need isn't the one we expected, and sometimes the greatest adventures await us in our golden years. Eleanor found her reason to live at an age when many people are preparing to give up. Her wolves didn't just fill her empty nest, they gave her wings to soar again. What unexpected family or purpose has brought new meaning to your later years? Have you ever experienced a bond that others couldn't understand but transformed your life completely? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love found you when you needed it most.